You're listening to News from the Underground on Resistance Radio, resistradio.com. Is the conviction of two men for the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence. Now this of course happened back in 1993 when this young black guy was stabbed and subsequently died. And yeah, I mean, I didn't take a huge amount of interest in this story, to be quite honest, until this week. I've always been aware of it. I mean, it's impossible not to have been aware of it. You know, it's been in the media quite a lot. I especially remember images from one of the hearings where these 5 guys who had been accused of the murder basically appeared out of this building, and they sort of strutted along, and then they started, you know, threatening and sort of snarling at the people who were waiting outside. I remember those images. I also remember them when they appeared on Trevor McDonald. They were being interviewed by Martin Bashir, which I've just watched again today, actually. Quite interesting to watch that. But I wasn't aware of, you know, the real intricate details of the case. And I'm not talking about this case in any attempt to be controversial, because I realise that some people might think I'm just sort of saying the things I'm going to say to try and be controversial in some way. But I really wouldn't have sort of got interested in this case if it hadn't been for just hearing the judge from the trial basically say that there are 2 or 3 more suspects still out there and that they shouldn't rest easy. And I just thought this was quite an incredible thing for a judge to have said, you know. The trial of these 2 men had just finished. They'd just been found guilty. This judge, who I believe was called Justice Treacy, I think his surname was, Treacy, he basically, he came out and said, he threatened people, basically, and it was very clear who he was implying was responsible for the murders and who could possibly face further action for this murder of Stephen Lawrence. And I just thought, this is unbelievable, you know. Since when has a judge been able to come out and say this? It was kind of outrageous, to be honest. And that got my interest. And I'm always interested in stories where there's a huge consensus about something. And, you know, it's undoubtable that there is a huge consensus, public consensus, about these guys who've just been found guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. You know, these guys have basically been deemed guilty by the public and by the mainstream media since day one, you know. And I just find that interesting, because whenever there's a sort of a blanket consensus on something, I always think, well, you know, could there be something more to this? So I started reading a few articles, and lo and behold, I mean, there are all kinds of dodgy aspects to this case, which I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to be talking about some of the anomalies and some of just the ways that the evidence doesn't really stack up, in my opinion. And of course, before I do that, you know, I have to give the disclaimer. I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not in any way racist. I don't like racists. I don't like racism. I don't like these people who were accused or who have been convicted in the case of 2 men of this crime. I don't like those guys. You know, they seem like very unpleasant people. We've all seen the footage, the surveillance footage that was taken of them, where they're being, you know, highly racist, and it's pretty disgusting. But I do have to give that disclaimer, because if I don't, then no doubt someone's going to say, oh, Brits are racist or whatever. Just as happened when I was talking about Zionism and somebody called me a Nazi, which is kind of ridiculous. You know, people who know me know that I'm not a Nazi and I'm not a racist. I mean, it's kind of terrible, really, that I have to make this disclaimer. You know, it's ridiculous, but you have to, don't you? And I've got no personal interest in this case at all, really. You know, like I said, I don't like these guys. There's no reason for me to defend them, but what this is all about for me is challenging the consensus, because I believe that the public's opinion of these men has been very craftily manipulated by the mainstream media. The public's sense of satisfaction that justice has been done this week is really a mirror of what they've been fed by the mainstream media, because these guys have been tried by media since 1993. There's no doubt that they've been tried by the media, and you know, possibly they were involved, possibly one of this gang of 5 did it, but from the evidence that I've been looking at, there are big doubts that the 2 who were convicted this week were responsible for it. 2 men by the name of David Norris and Gary Dobson. Those are the 2 who were found guilty this week. And you know, it's quite interesting, really, because one of the guys, Gary Dobson, had already been acquitted of the crime of murdering Stephen Lawrence. In fact, there have been a couple of failed prosecutions of these guys. The first guys who were arrested after the murder were called Neil Acorts and Luke Knight. So the first people who were arrested weren't even the guys who were sent down this week, and they were charged with murder, but the Crown Prosecution Service actually had to drop the case because there was simply no evidence. Now after that, what happened was the family of Stephen Lawrence, who, you know, totally understandably wanted to get justice for their murdered son, they couldn't seem to get justice by using the police, because the police's investigation had failed. So they decided to launch a private prosecution against all 5 men, and the private prosecution also didn't go very well at all, and all of the men were acquitted. Well, 2 of the men didn't even go to trial because there was simply no evidence against them, and 3 of the men were acquitted due to the main witness, who was Stephen Lawrence's best friend, being deemed an unreliable witness. So that was another collapsed case against the men. Now these men were initially suspected because immediately after the murder, the police had received, I think, 20 odd phone calls naming these guys as being the murderers. And you know, I was thinking about this today, and you know, it's very dangerous to rely on hearsay evidence. I've experienced this myself, just in a very minor and very insignificant way, but you know, just from my sort of presence on YouTube, for example. I mean, I've had people say there are lots of things about me which have been simply untrue, but just because somebody says something, there are other people who are also going to join in and say the same thing, and you know, there are people who bear some kind of grudge against you who just join in. So could that be the case with these guys, that they were fairly notorious in their area, sort of thuggish, you know, would-be wannabe gangsters? Could it be the case that all of these people who gave their names were simply, you know, jumping on the bandwagon and giving the name of, a notorious group of young lads in this area. Because it makes you think, like, how did all of these people who made these reports, like within, I think, the first few hours of the murder, I mean, how could they possibly know that it was these 5 guys who'd done it? It doesn't make sense, really. If the 5 guys had done it and had told somebody that they'd done it, or there'd been another witness to them doing it, it seems unlikely that that information would have spread amongst so many different people in one area so quickly. It doesn't really make sense to me. But anyway, that's by the by, really. So yeah, 2 collapsed cases against these guys, and this is one of the sort of scary aspects of the whole case, really, because the guy who went down this week, Gary Dobson, he was acquitted back in 1994 of the murder, and before 2005, before the new Labour government changed the law, there was a law known as double jeopardy, which meant that if you'd previously been acquitted of a crime, you couldn't again be tried for that crime. That law, which apparently had been in place for like 800 years or something like that, it was a really long-standing law. That was basically swept aside by the new Labour government. The double jeopardy law was dropped, and yeah, Gary Dobson was a victim of that. He'd been acquitted in 94, and in 2007, when the police said they had new evidence, he was subsequently investigated. He was arrested in 2010, arrested and charged in September 2010. In April 2011, his original acquittal was quashed following a 2-day hearing, and the story goes on from there, basically, up until his sentencing this week to, I think, 15 years or something like that. It was like 14 and 15 years they were given. So yes, this double jeopardy law no longer in place in Britain. This fundamental aspect of law whereby an acquitted person could no longer be tried again for the same crime. Well, you can now. So if you're ever convicted, if you're ever charged with a crime and then acquitted of that crime, well, you can't rest easy anymore, because at some point in the future the police could find evidence or pretend to find evidence, and you could find yourself in court again charged with the same crime. Yeah, so as I said earlier, these guys have been tried in the media from day one, even though there was no evidence beyond the reports that they'd received from people in the locality. There was no physical evidence connecting these guys to the murder or to the crime scene. The police actually had them under surveillance, and one of the guys was seen walking out of his house with a bin bag which looked like it contained clothes, but the police didn't stop him, didn't find out what was in the bag, so it was an almighty police cock-up, basically. He could have been disposing of clothes, but he might not have been. There might have been something innocent in that bag. We really can't tell because of this police cock-up. But yes, anyway, after the collapses of the trials, of course, trial by media continued, and this reached a kind of a head, really, in 1997, when the Daily Mail had on its front cover the headline, "Murderers," in bold text, "Murderers. The Mail accuses these men of killing. If we are wrong, let them sue us." And there were pictures of the 5 suspects on the front page as well. Despite the fact there was no evidence linking them to the murder scene, despite the fact that 3 witnesses at the scene couldn't identify any of the guys who were suspected of the murder. So there was really nothing, there was no evidence against the guys. They had been acquitted, or the cases had collapsed, And yet still in 1997 the Daily Mail felt bold enough to put this on its front page, murderers. There was no way that the guys who were sentenced this week were ever going to be given a fair trial. No way at all, considering the previous 17 years or 18 years media coverage of them, and the fact that they had been blamed for this crime from day one, regardless of the evidence. So anyway, what was the evidence? I mean, why did these guys this week find themselves on trial again and convicted for the murder? Well, basically, the police had started using a new forensic laboratory, a private forensic company, actually. In the original trial, in fact, in most original trials in the past, it was a government-owned forensics lab who carried out the analysis of evidence and exhibits. But the police have begun to farm out this kind of work to private companies, which raises questions about, possibly people could be bribed to come up with results and stuff if they were working in a private sphere rather than in a public forensic lab where there would be more checks and balances and more oversight. So yeah, this private lab called LGC Forensics basically started analysing the old evidence, which was obviously from 1993. This was like 14 years later they started analysing it again, and lo and behold, they managed to find some incriminating evidence on the clothes of Gary Dobson and David Norris. They found a microscopic spot of blood on the collar of a jacket owned by Gary Dobson. It was like 0.5 millimeters wide at its widest, and they also found some fibers on his clothing which belonged to Stephen Lawrence, or the clothing of Stephen Lawrence, and they also found hairs and fibers on David Norris's clothing. So yeah, you would think, okay, that's pretty conclusive evidence that these guys were there at the murder scene, that they had been in contact with Stephen Lawrence. But actually, when you read about those pieces of evidence, well, I mean, there's a very high chance, in my opinion, that they had been contaminated, because the articles belonging to the accused had been stored in the same place as the articles belonging to Stephen Lawrence, been stored together, and the actual packaging that the clothes were in had started to deteriorate after 14 years. It's a long time. The packaging hadn't been designed to last, and the tape which sealed the packages had actually started to come apart. It had lost its stickiness, so there was obviously the potential for other fibers or other bits of material to enter those bags from the other bags they were stored with, and there would have been good reason for lots of material belonging to Stephen Lawrence being in those bags, because when he was taken to hospital, his clothing was actually cut off him by a nurse. This obviously released a shower of material, as it was called in court. So the clothing belonging to Stephen Lawrence would have had lots of minuscule fabrics and things like that. This clothing was stored with Gary Dobson's clothing and David Norris's clothing. I mean, it kind of gets worse than that, because initially apparently some of the articles weren't even put into bags. At one point, the jacket which the forensics lab had identified a microscopic piece of blood on the collar, that had actually been taken out of its packaging and lain on a cell floor so that it could be photographed. There's another highly dubious point that some of the officers who were handling the clothes belonging to the accused subsequently visited the Lawrence family, so there was obviously a chance of contamination there. The same people who were going to the Lawrence family home were actually working with the exhibits from the accused. So lots of questions about possible contamination. And you have to ask, Gary Dobson, who was convicted on the basis of this microscopic blood spot on his collar, I mean, if he'd been at the murder scene, or if he'd been wielding the knife himself, surely there would have been more blood on his jacket than this solitary microscopic spot of blood. That doesn't really make much sense to me. If he was there would presumably be much more than that, much more than this one tiny spot. So, I mean, that doesn't make much sense either. Yes, and some of the other, dubious aspects of all of this, because in the article that I wrote, I actually ask, well, why have 2 men been convicted of this murder, and why are 3 men facing the possibility of being convicted for murder, when it seems pretty clear that there was only one person wielding the knife. One person was the stabber, basically, it seems. Stephen Lawrence died from 2 stab wounds. I think one was at the top of his chest and the other was in his arm. He died from loss of blood, basically. He didn't die immediately at the scene. I mean, he was actually able to run off. I think he managed to run like 100 meters down the road before collapsing and dying of blood loss. But I mean, my question was, how can all 5 of this gang be equally culpable? Well, I mean, I have since found out that there is a law, apparently. Let me just get the information about that. I've forgotten what it's called now. Yeah, the law of joint enterprise. And this law does allow for whole groups of people to be found equally guilty of murder if they're part of a gang who murders somebody. I'll just read out a couple of paragraphs from this article about joint enterprise. How do you solve a murder where a gang is involved? There is no evidence as to who inflicted the fatal blow, and no one is talking. The answer lies in a powerful legal doctrine known as joint enterprise. In short, it enables entire groups of people to be prosecuted for murder, even though they may have played very different roles in a killing. So presumably that's the law under which these 2 guys were convicted this week, because even the judge admitted that there was no evidence for these 2 guys having carried a knife. Let me read out the sentencing remarks from Justice Treacy. He said, "Evidence does not prove so that I could be sure that either of you," meaning Norris and Dobson, "had a knife, but the person who used it did so with your knowledge and approval." You see, I mean, I don't know how he can possibly know that. I don't know how he can possibly know that every member of this gang was equally aware of the fact that someone was going to use a knife. They might have been aware that one of them had a knife, but I don't think that he can possibly know that every member of that gang had knowledge of that knife and approved of its use in a stabbing, in my opinion. Anyway, he continued that he believed their complicity was proven by, quote, "the brief nature of the attack, in which those who were unarmed did not themselves inflict blows or kicks of sufficient gravity to leave injury or involve themselves in a sustained attack, as they would if this was a conventional plan to beat up." So basically what the judge is saying here is, because the group of 5 or 6 people who attacked Stephen Lawrence, because they didn't all take part in a particularly violent attack, because the kicks and the punches weren't especially violent, that is proof of the fact that these people knew he was going to be stabbed, which is just kind of absurd to me. That's not evidence at all that they were all aware and complicit in the stabbing of Stephen Lawrence. You know, that's very poor evidence that the kicks and punches inflicted on him weren't violent enough. This is an absurd argument, really. So anyway, yeah, my questions there are about how complicit all members of the gang were who attacked Stephen Lawrence, because I don't think they were. You know, I don't think it's possible well, it is possible, but I don't think it's fair to find them equally guilty when one person had the knife and one person presumably stabbed him. You know, he could have done that of his own accord without the knowledge or complicity of anybody else in that gang. But also, of course, you know, this assumes that the people who killed Stephen Lawrence were the 5 that were accused. Now, maybe they were all there, but you know, apart from this newfound forensic evidence, which, as I've just detailed, is suspect, there's no other evidence against Gary Dobson or David Norris. In fact, as well as Gary Dobson being acquitted of the crime back in 1994, the police at a later date said that he was quite likely innocent. This is a story from The Independent. 2 of Lawrence murder gang could be innocent, police say. This was from back in 1999. 2 of the 5 men widely regarded as prime suspects for Stephen Lawrence's murder could be innocent, police believe. Detectives have decided that Gary Dobson and Luke Knight were probably not part of the racist gang that stabbed to death the black teenager in Eltham, southeast London, in April 1993. So yeah, he was acquitted. The police said he could be innocent. There's no evidence connecting him to the scene in terms of eyewitnesses. There's never been any confessions from any of these guys, which, you know, makes it all the more strange how everybody named them immediately, because if they were so careful throughout the last 18 years to keep this quiet, you think they would have been quiet immediately and not told anybody. So I don't know where those reports come from. Of course, we have this footage, this secret surveillance footage of these guys in the flat, and this hasn't been allowed to be used in court because it was secret surveillance footage. But this has definitely been used by the media, you know, to prejudice the case against these men. I mean, the video is disgusting. They're being highly racist, using very violent language. One of them is, you know, acting out stabbing someone with a knife. And I mean, when you say it like this, when you talk about it, yeah, it sounds really highly suspect. It sounds really dodgy. Racist, like playing with knives, pretending to stab people, but without wanting to sound too unreasonable. I mean, you know, who hasn't done things in their own house when they've been with friends that could look bad and that could be construed as being evidence of somebody being, you know, violent or racist or something? I mean, I know that I've done things that maybe has been a joke, or I've just been messing around, and you know, I don't think you can use this evidence to say that these guys definitely murdered Stephen Lawrence. I mean, it's not possible. It shows them to be, you know, very unpleasant thugs, basically. But you know, I've met people who are interested in knives, who maybe mess around with knives. We've all met racists. I mean, you know, it doesn't mean that somebody is capable of murder, or that somebody has actually carried out a murder, does it? In fact, I mean, one of the guys who was convicted this week, Gary Dobson, I mean, he doesn't even play with a knife in the video. I think he does say something racist in one of the videos, but then in another one, you actually hear him saying, "Oh, some black people are all right," and you know, apparently he had black friends, so he wasn't as, you know, offensively racist as some of the other members of the gang. and there wasn't any evidence on film that he was, obsessed with knives or whatever. So in terms of his conviction, that footage really has no part to play. Yeah, I just find the whole thing, a bit worrying, really, when the police, use this kind of secret surveillance footage. I mean, we all say things that can be taken out of context or that can make us look really bad. I mean, it does make these guys look, really bad, admittedly, but it's not evidence that they murdered Stephen Lawrence, is it? In my opinion. Anyway, what else was I going to talk about regarding the case? Yeah, so these guys have gone down anyway, and Gary Dobson, I mean, he's consistently, well, they've all consistently claimed they're innocent, but I mean, his parents provided him with an alibi, and immediately after he was sentenced, both he and his father said to the judge, you've convicted the wrong man here, which isn't proof that he's innocent, but it's not proof of that at all, but it's just interesting anyway. And I just found the whole thing interesting because of the way these guys have been tried in the media. The media had convicted these guys before they'd ever been convicted in a court of law, and I just think it's worrying when it's so obvious that if the state wants to see somebody in prison, then the state will eventually get somebody in prison, and that's what's happened with these two. Even though the guy had been acquitted, now he's in prison. And I've talked about the possible contamination of the evidence. I mean, we can never rule out either that it was deliberate contamination, that this was a setup, because how many cases have there been in the past where the police have been totally corrupt and framed people, the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, they were framed. There was another case more recently, just last summer, the case of the Cardiff 3. This was a case where I think it was, obviously three men, but I think there were more people accused. 3 men went down for killing a 20-year-old woman in Cardiff, and it later transpired that it was a total setup, and 13 policemen are now on trial. They're accused of agreeing to mould, manipulate, influence and fabricate evidence to frame the group for this killing in 1988. So, these frame-ups, they do happen. The police do frame people if they're under pressure to come up with a result, and it's very obvious that the police have been under pressure to get a result in this case, because we had the whole Macpherson inquiry into the police. This was when the whole thing about the institutional racism came to light, and the Metropolitan Police were really slammed after the Stephen Lawrence murder and accused of being institutionally racist. So there's no doubt they've been under a lot of pressure to come up with results, and there's always the possibility there that this was a total setup. Can't rule it out, that's for sure. And anyway, I've been reading around the internet trying to get some different opinions about this. I thought I'd hop over to Stormfront because I knew they would be sort of up in arms about this. Stormfront being the white nationalist website run by David Duke. I mean, you can find some interesting information on there. I mean, it's full of racists, but I mean, they were up in arms about this. They were talking about how there was no justice in Britain anymore, and I mean, the sort of more coherent and more rational people were making valid points about the fact that this case really is a cause célèbre, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of odd how this case has become so massive and so influential, because I mean, without wanting to sound heartless or cruel, I mean, stabbings happen all the time, don't they? I mean, every day somebody's stabbed. I mean, how many people have been murdered in England since Stephen Lawrence? How how many stabbings have there been where maybe the assailants were black and the victim was white, and would that have been given as much attention by the mainstream media? I mean, the people on Stormfront were very much berating this kind of liberal. Well, I mean, some of them were basically talking about cultural Marxism, which we've been hearing a lot about in terms of the Andre Breivik thing in Norway. Cultural Marxism, and how when you can't really say anything without being accused of being a racist. And I mean, I thought there were some interesting points there, and of course there were others who were talking about the big conspiracy, that this was part of the Zionist divide and rule agenda to set off a race war in Britain. Which is something that I've talked about recently in terms of the EDL, and the guy behind the EDL, a guy called Alan Lake, who is very obviously a Zionist, and he's talked about this war between Muslims and whites in England, and that's very much part of the plan to set these two factions at each other's throats to divide and rule. So that's another possible conspiracy angle, but I haven't really delved into that too much. Wasn't prepared to go down that rabbit hole quite yet. But anyway, guys, check out that article. I mean, if anyone else wants to do a bit more research, would be interesting to hear your thoughts on it. I'm not defending racists, don't like these guys, but I don't want to see the wrong man go to prison for something that I don't think he did. I mean, particularly with Gary Dobson, I think there's been a miscarriage of justice there. But because somebody's been convicted of it, everyone's happy with that now. Justice apparently has been done. I mean, this week as well, there's been talk of prosecuting his parents for lying, and I read this stuff and I just think, like, well, what if he's telling the truth? What if he's innocent? He's going to prison now for 15 years. His parents, who've given him the alibi, could be prosecuted for simply defending their son, and it's just crazy, isn't it? Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Not trying to be controversial, just really caught my interest and was good evidence for me as to how you can think something, particularly because that's what you're told by the mainstream media, but when you actually dig a bit deeper, the reality can possibly be different.